Hello, ninth and 10th grade. This is your World History Chapter 16. If you've taken a little look through your book, you'll notice we're really close to the end. In fact, this is the last chapter we're covering this year because we're only covering the first half of World History's textbook. We are still talking about the music of the 16th and 1700s. We're talking about specifically the music of the 17th century now, which is the 1600s. We're going to talk about the creation of the classical style. What we think of as classical music today, it's almost anything that's very, very formal, but the truth is classical is a very specific time frame in this type of music. Now, overall, it can be called classical, but then there's classical within that as a subcategory as well. Just like before this, there was Baroque, and then after this, there will be Romanticism. Baroque and Romantics, two of my favorite periods, classical, one of my least favorite, so go figure. But the music of the 17th century led to an even greater music in the 18th century. This is the 1700s, establishing the classical style. And the two leading musicians of the latter half of the 18th century were Franz Joseph Haydn, who is famous for his work the Surprise Symphony, and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Now, typically in the classroom, we'd be parking right here. You'd be listening to the Surprise Sympathy. Wow, you can't say it without saying sympathy. Symphony, there we go. We'd be listening to the Surprise Symphony, or at least a portion of it, by Haydn. We would be listening to some of Mozart's great works. We're not in the classroom right now, and there is no point in me slowing down. All I can do is tell you, look, you have the information here. Go ahead and get on YouTube and listen to the Surprise Symphony, and then listen to some music by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. It really is beautiful music. It's just not my personal favorite genre of the classical genres. Okay, so Franz Joseph Haydn, he was an Austrian. He wrote about 100 symphonies. A symphony tends to have 4 parts to it, including the Surprise Symphony, and 2 notable oratorios, The Creation and the Seasons, which means there was biblical references included in there to be sung. He's also known for writing very cheerful music for the church. He lived in Austria, where the Catholic Church was a big part of that. Also, the Lutheran Church was a big part, and organ music was becoming the big thing during this time. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, we all kind of know him a little bit better than Haydn. He was also Austrian. He was a child prodigy. That's a really strange word. Prodigy means baked too early or cooked too early. He was a prodigy, meaning that he had like a grown-up brain and a little teeny tiny head, but it was even more than grown-up. He had an ability to bring music to life. He had an incredibly high talent and genius. So a child of highly unusual talent or genius is called a prodigy. At 3 years old, he was just amusing himself at the piano, which was a fairly new instrument. Before this, the type of instrument that had keys that struck strings, because piano is a string instrument, it had keys that plucked strings. That was called either a spinet or a harpsichord. But the idea of the piano meant that you could create different tones based on how loudly you played. Piano was originally called pianoforte because it could play both loud and soft sounds. The spinet or the virginal, what's the other one? I just said it. Harpsichord could only play one volume, but the piano could play both soft and loud. So at 3, he was amusing himself at the piano. At 4, he began music lessons formally. At 5, he was composing his first pieces, and you all know at least one of them because you've sung it. You ready to sing it? Okay. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are, up above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. And if you've never sung Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, you probably know it as A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P. Same tune. But this tune, it was very accessible. He composed that when he was still a child, and so everybody knows a little bit of Mozart. When he was 7 years old, he took a grand tour of Europe. The grand tour was a term that was given to young men when they usually finished high school, and they would go and visit the different artistic areas of Europe. They would go see everything they'd studied in school. His grand tour is a little different. He's going to be performing on his grand tour. He performed in all the musical centers of the day, including at the Palace of Versailles, where he got to meet Marie Antoinette and proposed to her. He was 7. She didn't really take him seriously. Plus, she was already married. Okay, at 9, he wrote his first symphony. This is a classical piece of work with 4 movements in it. At 11, he was writing his first opera. So the first time he's writing this musical piece where everything is actually sung. By the time he was 13, he had mastered all of the musical forms that were available for his day. But he died when he was only 35. So he didn't live a very long time. Before his death at 35, he composed over 600 works, including 48 symphonies, several famous operas, and many piano concertos and sonatas. His life, unfortunately, by the time he was 13, he was pushed into a lifestyle that was really more about partying. He was still a hard worker. He was still a genius, but everybody was so flattering to him that it just didn't it wasn't good for him. And so as a result, he became more interested in partying and enjoying the seamier sides of life. And as a result, it led to his very, very early death when he was only 35. Now, he got to meet Ludwig van Beethoven when he was in his 30s. Ludwig van Beethoven was still a child when he met Mozart, and Mozart recognized something in Beethoven and said, this kid's a genius right here. And that was from one genius to another. He was a composer, a German composer, whose style of music was the climax of the classical style and began the Romantic period. During his time, the growing middle class had begun to support music as a business, so he was actually writing sheet music, and people were buying sheet music and playing it in their own homes. That was the first time that was really being done. Unfortunately, he had a very abusive father who wanted him to be the next Mozart. He lied about Beethoven's age and forced him to perform and act as if he were a very, very much younger child, a small child. He couldn't really keep that up because even, if you got a 5th grader trying to act like a 3rd grader, eventually it's going to break through that he's not really in 3rd grade. You know what I mean? So his father was very abusive, and there is some evidence that he caused injury to Beethoven's ears, possibly by slapping him in the ear or doing something abusive. And as a result, in his later life, Beethoven became deaf, completely deaf in both ears. He did write piano sonatas. These are long piano solos like the Moonlight Sonata. He also wrote some very short pieces like For Elise, which almost every person who takes piano lessons eventually learns to butcher. And then he wrote many symphonies, are known as orchestral works. And his most famous symphony, strangely enough, had a choral element to it that isn't usually seen in a symphony at all. Usually a symphony is just purely orchestral, but he heard the voices in his head. By this time he was completely deaf, and he created this symphony that had a choral component, and it's just so beautiful. His 5th symphony is his best known symphony. Listen to it online. I'm not going to try and hum it for you, but you will know it as soon as you hear it. The 9th symphony is his last symphony, and it's also my favorite, my personal favorite. I think it's absolutely gorgeous. And when the chorus and the soloists and the finale begin to sing, I tear up every time. I can't help it. And later on, the tune for the 9th symphony was borrowed and set to the words of a hymn, which have become my favorite hymn. It's Joyful, Joyful, We Adore Thee. It came from the 9th Symphony. This last little section here is called Ode to Joy, and it's really gorgeous. unfortunately for Beethoven, when he was toward the end of his life, and he was toward the end of his life, and he was writing the Ninth Symphony, and he had the chance to conduct the symphony. It was beautiful. It was absolutely gorgeous. But when it was over, he was standing facing his orchestra and was just so brokenhearted because he didn't get the reaction he was hoping for from the performance of the symphony. Remember, he's conducting this completely deaf. So he had no reaction, and he was just so torn up that people didn't love this last song he was creating for them. And finally, one of his friends walked up onto the stage and turned the composer around to face the audience, and they were all on their feet cheering. He didn't get the response that he thought he got simply because he couldn't hear it. He had to see it. So, good job, Beethoven. Okay, talking about art in the modern age began in the 16th century with my favorite engraver, Albrecht Dürer. Okay, and for those of you smart Alex who are like, oh yeah, name another engraver. Okay, I also like Doré, and I also like Escher, but honestly, this guy's my favorite. Absolutely my favorite. This is a self-portrait, so we know exactly what he looked like. He was interested in getting the realistic portion of himself. This is not the most flattering portrait that he could have painted. He's a little bare on top. You notice his hair is a little straggly on top, and then it's really long and ringleted on the bottom. But we see here the style of the day. We see his hands, very beautiful and expressive, his eyes, his face. He's actually quite good looking for today's I think he's good looking, but his hair, I mean, gotta do something with the hair, dude. Okay, but Albrecht Dürer, fantastic artist, and he started out not with paintbrushes, he started out with metals. He was trained as a goldsmith. So Albrecht Dürer, trained as a goldsmith, he mastered the art of goldsmith's engraving, which is what his father wanted him to do. His father wanted him to be a gold or silversmith. It was fairly easy work. It was very delicate work, but it wasn't like you didn't need a lot of strength for it. And his father was hoping that because it was in such an expensive material that his son would become very wealthy as a goldsmith. Now, when he learned about engraving as a goldsmith, he decided he wanted to learn other arts as well. So he apprenticed himself to a painter and a woodcutter. And from them, he learned how to use the pen, the brush, oils, and watercolors. And it's around this time that his father said, I hooked you up with a goldsmith to learn the art of goldsmithing. You are going on to art. I'm not going to support you anymore. And so he ended up getting this new apprenticeship and starting really all over again to learn more skills, but his father refused to support him in his pursuit of art. He developed the art of wood cutting. This is making prints by engraving designs on wooden blocks. Think of a stamp. If you've ever played with stamps, like rubber stamps, back in the day, the wood cutting, that was what was used to print whole pages. This is before there is a lot of illustration in books. So in order to get the illustration in a book, you had to carve an entire plank of wood and then use that and press it down. It didn't last for very long because after a while the wood gets really wet and mealy, and so you lose all your sharp edges. But if you want to try a really fun engraving kind of idea for yourself, since you're at home and you're not really doing anything except for cleaning and, doing weird experiments, go back to elementary when you made those potato stamps. I don't know if you guys ever did that or not, but I remember doing it. We took a potato to school, we cut it in half, we carved a design into the potato, and it had to be that the design we wanted on the paper had to be raised up. So you had to carve around. You had to take away the negative space. Then you can dip it in paint or ink and you can use it to stamp on a piece of paper. This is basically the same thing that Albert Dürer was doing, but he was carving in wood. Now his paintings, when he painted, it shows his concern with accuracy. He wanted to accurately portray nature, and his works were made available to the public. And this is really the first time we're seeing art being displayed for the public to purchase. Before this, it was patrons paying artists to paint what they wanted the artist to paint. And they would usually go into churches or into somebody's house. Now you could go into a store or a gallery and you could buy a painting by an artist. You could go and do that yourself. You didn't tell him what to paint. You just looked and saw, hey, great rabbit. Got to have that for my house. These are some of my, well, obviously I'm the one making the slideshow. So yeah, some of my favorite Dürer paintings, you're going to see them right now. So I love this bunny. And I did get to actually see this one in person because it's at the Getty Center Museum. So if you ever get up to the Getty, you should. It's beautiful up there. The gardens are gorgeous, but the artwork is phenomenal. And there is this bunny painting. And I was so excited when I saw it. I'm like, oh, okay. Because, that's what you do when you're a nerd. Okay, his most popular work is his drawing Praying Hands. The story behind this is after his father told him he was no longer going to support him, he and a fellow artist decided to become roommates. But they couldn't both take art classes or go through the apprenticeship at the same time. So the roommate said, I will work and bring in money for us to eat and to pay rent. You go learn your art. And then when you've learned everything, then you take care of me as an artist. You make money from your art. And then I'll go and do my thing. I'll go learn art myself. Well, the man worked very, very hard and he worked with his hands. And as a result, he ended up injuring his hands, specifically his knuckles. They would get swollen. He'd get a lot of blisters. And he basically ruined his hands to the point where he could no longer be an actual artist. He just couldn't grip the paintbrushes or anything like he should. Well, the story is that Dürer came in one night after being an apprentice and learning art and seeing his friend with his ruined hands praying, and he sketched it out really quick. This is a sketch that he did, and that became his most famous drawing. The story goes on to after Albert Dürer became a famous artist, he did help take care of his friend for the rest of his life. Okay, I love this. This is really beautiful. Albert Dürer learned engraving on gold and later silver, and then he learned how to make engravings on woodcuts. Well, he then was able to adapt the two. He discovered that if he engraved on a piece of metal and they used that to print, it kept the sharp edges for a lot longer than a piece of wood did. It kept it in perpetuity. So somebody described a rhinoceros to him. I don't know if he saw it in a zoo, but he created this gorgeous etching. Oh my goodness, it's so pretty. This gorgeous etching of a rhinoceros. And you can see the detail, how he has the rhinoceros almost looking like he's in battle armor. It's really cool. The detail on this is phenomenal. This is his Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, and it would have been printed in books just like this. You can see all the incredible detail on each of the horsemen with the bows and the arrows. You can even see directly behind the third man riding, you can see the scales of famine flying behind him. Death is skeletal and riding on a skeletal horse, and it's trampling over the dead. It's just really remarkably sketched. Well, it's not sketched, it's etched. It's actually carved into metal. This is how he did this. This is one of his paintings. It is not my favorite, but it's one of his earlier paintings. And this is Adam and Eve in the garden. You can see Eve has a piece of fruit one in each hand. And in one hand, there is the serpent's head is also like eating the fruit or whatnot. Adam has a parrot on a branch over his shoulder. So this whole thing, I mean, it's technically it's correct. It's very nice. It's just not really my thing. I think I am most thrown by the fact that Eve looks a lot like George Washington, and I just can't get over that. So I'm sorry. I'm just, that's just me. Okay. This, my favorite of all time, Albrecht Dürer paintings. This is a painting, and it's amazing. Look at the detail in this. You're looking at a true artist when you're looking at a patch of weeds and you're looking at it and thinking, this is gorgeous. But it is. Look at the vibrancy, the color, the detail. It is absolutely remarkable. It looks like a photograph. It's so beautiful. This is a guy who understood realism before realism was a thing. Okay, Lucas Cranach. He was a German artist, and he was also a friend and follower of Martin Luther. So he was the one that we get a lot of Luther's portraits from. He painted Luther and his wife repeatedly because they were paying clients. He was also a court painter for Frederick the Wise of Saxony, and Luther was connected with Frederick the Wise. But we know what Luther and his wife look like because of Lucas Cranach. So here is Luther, Martin Luther, on the left, and then his wife. You guys remember her name? It's Catherine, right? On the right. And then Hans Holbein the Younger. He was a German artist who was one of the greatest portrait painters of all time. He was from Germany. He was a Catholic and had to leave Germany because the Lutherans in the area of Germany he lived were destroying all the Catholic churches and the paintings, the statuary, and they were actually beating up Catholics in the street. That is not okay, by the way. That's not all right. So he escaped and he got a job in England at the court of Henry VIII. And he was the last of the German Renaissance painters. He was one of the best. And he is the one who is the star of this wonderful documentary. And I strongly suggest it. I said it yesterday, or the last time we were together. Yeah, it was yesterday. I did recommend it then. I'm recommending it again. The host is very high energy nerd. I like him because of that. Give him a shot. He will take you behind the scenes of what Holbein actually was able to do within the court of Henry VIII, and it is gorgeous, amazingly beautiful art. Please watch this documentary. You're not required to, but I strongly recommend it because it's really great. I love it. Okay, here is one of Holbein's paintings. This is Henry VIII at the height of his power and also the height of his weight. Yeah, height of his weight. Henry VIII was a very tall man, but he was also a very large man. At the end of his life, he weighed about 400 pounds. But before he hit middle age, he was an incredible athlete. He was a big-time hunter. He had to have a very strong horse, but he was a hunter. He was a dancer. He was an actor. He was considered a Renaissance man at a time when England was just playing with that Renaissance timeline. So he was considered very handsome for his day. He was also considered very athletic until the end of his life, when he just kind of, ended up happening to what happens to a lot of people. He ended up with a lot of joint pain and stopped moving and gained a lot of weight. This is Edward, his son, Edward VI. Isn't he a cutie patootie? Oh. And that's his mummy next to him. This is Jane Seymour, who unfortunately died in childbirth. Edward VI lived until he was 16, and then he died of tuberculosis. But before he died, he had his little portrait painted. And in fact, almost every wife of Henry VIII was painted by Holbein. This is Holbein's family. He had to leave them in Germany when he went to England. That was just the arrangements that were made. And this is one of the last paintings he painted of his wife. He left to go work in England, and while he was gone, she passed away. Next, we have Rembrandt van Rijn. He was the greatest of the Dutch masters. He was known for his paintings, drawings, etchings, and he used those to probe into the souls of men. And he was more interested in probing into his own soul than anybody else's. That's why there are tons and tons and tons of self-portraits of Rembrandt. He was looking into his own soul whenever he painted himself. Here is one of his more famous paintings. This is The Autopsy. You can see a doctor here. There is a dead body on the slab, and he is going through and showing the anatomical makeup of the arm of this man. This is his most famous painting because it was his least liked painting when he was alive. This is called The Night Watch. A group of night watchmen asked him to please paint a painting of all of them, and he painted them coming out of their meeting place, but many of them are in the dark. Some have their faces completely hidden. They hated it. Right in the middle of it, you've got a little girl very well lit up, and she's carrying a chicken just walking through it, and nobody knows what that's about. He never said. So all of a sudden we got a little girl with a chicken in the middle of the night watch. Now, modern historians, art historians, have said it's a misnamed or misnomer that this is Night Watch because it's very dirty. The truth was the name of it was Night Watch because it was for a group of men called the Night Watch. And even after they cleaned it, it was still set at night with this very bright light. It cracks me up because I just noticed this. There's a guy all the way on the right-hand side who's peeking into the frame of the picture with his big drum like, hey, don't forget me. It's really funny. Oh, you can't even see him on this. Sorry. You'll have to look at it later. Rembrandt's greatest achievements were his realistic illustrations of Bible scenes portrayed from the perspective of a believing Christian. He was a Bible-believing Christian, and he portrayed the Bible the way it was written, which is really nice. It's kind of a nice change of pace. So here, he did make a little mistake in this. Here we have the defeat of Samson. He had a whole warehouse, Rembrandt did, not Samson. He had a whole warehouse of clothing where he would dress up the local Jews in his community as Old Testament characters and then paint them because, people in the Old Testament were Jewish. So he said, hey, we want to be one of my models. And they're like, sure. So there is a mistake here made. We have Delilah running out of a cave with Samson's hair in one hand and scissors in the other. We have Samson on the ground being tackled. He's being held down and his eyes are being plucked out, which is really gruesome. The big mistake here is that Delilah did not cut Samson's hair. That was a barber who did that. Like, nobody cares. Okay. This one, really rich, really well done. This is the writing on the wall. Okay, here you have Belshazzar, the king of Babylon, just before the Persians come in and wipe him and his whole family and kingdom out. And this is when God himself writes on the wall, Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. You have been weighed, you've been measured, you've been found wanting. In other words, you don't measure up. This is the crucifixion. And it's Christ actually being crucified. The cross is being lifted up and put into the hole. And he always painted himself at the crucifixions that he painted. He is in the blue hat at Jesus's feet because he saw himself as partially responsible for Christ's death. Christ died for the sins of mankind. He's a man, so that makes sense. Here is the taking Christ off the cross. And he is the man in the blue coat hanging over the cross and pulling and using the sheet to lower Christ. Jan Vermeer is one of my all-time favorites too. I love this period of history for art. He was an accomplished Dutch master from Holland. He produced relatively few paintings, but they're excellent. His best works, according to your book, are landscapes. He's much more famous for his interior of middle-class homes. Okay, he is really not famous for his landscapes. When I first read that, I was like, what? it's not the easiest thing in the world to find a Jan Vermeer landscape that is considered a masterpiece. His interior shots are the masterpiece here. Here is one of his landscapes, just to give you a flavor. Okay, there we go. And here is one of his interior pictures. He loved to do middle class people in their home. So we have the wall behind this woman. You notice it's a little pockmarked where it needs to be replastered. You've got the beautiful window in front of her. This is a kitchen table. She is pouring milk from a jug into a pot. And if you get closer to this painting, if you can get a better shot of it, you can see that the milk is actually braided as it flows, just like milk usually does when it's poured into a glass. You can see the detail in the basket on the wall next to her or behind her. The texture even on the bread, it's amazing. And he used this idea of a photograph. Well, it wasn't actually a recorded photograph. He just made a camera, not a photograph, a camera. He made a light box where he would paint from within the light box sometimes to get the perfect idea of what he wanted to paint. This is a woman who is measuring out her jewels. It's a metaphor for measuring out what is the most important in life. And she is visibly pregnant. So the idea that her jewels are probably not as important to her as the child she's carrying. This is very simply the girl with a pearl earring. No one really knows who she is, but there was a novel written based on the inspiration of just this painting and a movie made out of it. And it's just a girl in a turbaned headdress looking over her shoulder wearing a pearl earring, a very expensive large pearl earring. Okay, Jacob van Ruysdael, he was a Dutchman who was one of the greatest landscape painters of all time. He was a master at realistically painting trees, forests, graveyards, windmills, canals, stormy seas, cloudy skies in the Dutch countryside. So he was more famous for his landscape. Yeah. And I think we're going to have to stop here pretty soon. Let me see who we have next. Oh, there's one of his. This is the Jewish cemetery. I remember this one. Whoops, sorry. I think this is actually his most famous work, but your book says that the most famous work of his is the wheat fields. Again, I never saw this painting until I had to look it up for the notes. So I don't know if it's just different artistic takes on things, but there you have it. You need to know Ruysdael's most famous work is wheat fields, and he was a landscape artist. Okay, we're actually going to stop right here because we're going to get into the Baroque art period, and it is one of my all-time favorites because it is uber dramatic and beautiful. And so we will pick that up again next time. Don't forget to do your homework a little bit at a time so you're never really stuck with a whole bunch of homework to do. We are going to finish history early this year because, you know, we just don't have the time in the classroom that we normally would spend. So you're going to be doing a lot of that stuff on your own if you are so inclined, and I do hope that you will be inclined to do that. You will be spending a lot more time after history's done working on literature. We're going to finish up the literature book as well. But yeah, we'll probably be done with the history this week, at least for lectures. And then you can just turn in your whole book once all of your history homework is done and the test review, which you can start working on it now if you like, but make sure you're getting your homework done a little bit at a time. And I will talk to you next time. Bye.